Why, hello, my friends. Do you like Zelda? Well, what do you know? I like Zelda too. Small world, isn't it? Well, as long as we're both here and we both like Zelda, I have got something of a theory for you. It's not just a theory about the story though, but the direction the story might take in future titles. Sort of a theory about the series as a whole. See, I recently did a video called 5 Nintendo Villains That Should Retire, and spoiler alert, the final villain on the list was Ganon. I argued that we've seen enough of the guy and it's time for Hyrule to be threatened by a new villain or two. I kept things pretty brief in the video, but the idea was part of a much bigger discussion I've been meaning to cover for a while now. See, based on what we've seen in the last few games, I feel like there's a good chance we're about to see a massive shift in the Zelda universe. For a number of reasons I'll soon go into, it just feels like thematically the series is ready to launch into new territory. Now, I'm well aware of the dangers of Zelda theories. It's obvious that Nintendo just doesn't seem to care about maintaining a consistent canon nearly as much as we wish they did, and while I think theories are a lot of fun, I'll admit that often we're just trying our best to fill holes that the Zelda writers left with no intention of filling themselves. Sometimes we try to draw conclusions when there probably aren't actually any to draw. So I know that I could easily be wrong here, and in a few years they might make a Zelda game and I'll go, oh, okay, wow, I guess I should go delete that video I made, but at the moment at least, I am fairly confident. I think Zelda is nearing a turning point. And you know what? Since we're both here, I like Zelda, you like Zelda, how about I tell you why? First things first, I want to talk a little about Skyward Sword. I wasn't a fan of the overall plot, but the game did give us one gigantic story revelation that forever changed how we viewed the Zelda universe. In the game, we learn about the goddess Hylia, who long ago fought the evil entity known as Demise with the help of an unnamed hero. It's revealed that Princess Zelda is a direct reincarnation of Hylia, and that of course Link is the reincarnation of the hero. The biggest lore bomb drops at the very end though. After you defeat Demise himself, he tells you that the world has been cursed. A quote, reincarnation of his hatred will live on, and he, Hylia, and the hero are going to be locked in a bloody struggle for all eternity. They'll all reincarnate and fight forever. Boom. With a couple sentences, Demise explains how and why the entire series works the way it does. And it's really quite genius. Nintendo loves to make Zelda after Zelda after Zelda, and one has to wonder why there are so many different Links and Zeldas and timelines. Well, there you go. That's why. That's why the same basic Zelda story is doomed to repeat itself. And if you want some headcanon, I think the curse extends beyond just the three of them. I think it also explains why other characters and themes forever recur throughout the ages. It's why there's always a Kakariko village. It's why characters unrelated by bloodline have similar names. It's why there are tingles in games set thousands of years apart spread across all three timelines. Again, it's very convenient for Nintendo, who probably just likes callbacks more than anything, but I think it raises the immersion and sense of consistency in the Zelda world. It's all doomed to repeat itself, at least in small ways, even if there are major story beats that change on occasion. The games all have the same basic elements, and there's a good reason for that. So once that aspect of the canon was blown open, it was anybody's guess what the next Zelda would be about. Now that we know Ganon is an incarnation of Demise, how can the next Zelda present him as a villain again without feeling too samey? Because we'd already come to expect Ganon in each game, naturally, but once we had a reason to really expect Ganon, I wondered if the next game would really just be Ganon. Again. Because that's how it's gonna be forever, right? Well, if you ask me, in the context of Skyward Sword, Nintendo gave us the perfect follow-up. If Skyward Sword sits at the beginning of the timeline and explains Ganon's existence, Breath of the Wild takes us all the way to the other end of the timeline and gives us a version of Ganon we've never seen before. Gone is his humanoid form. Gone is any semblance of sanity. He's been reduced to a psychotic monster, one that seems incapable of even speaking. Most of the game, he's not even a beast. He's this crazy, swirly pig spirit, and timeline? What's a timeline? Breath of the Wild is set so far in the future, it doesn't even fit on any recognizable branch. Most importantly though, and this was a big brain explosion moment for me, the game references multiple branches. Plenty of Zelda games have mentioned the ones that came previous, that's Zelda's whole thing, but Breath of the Wild calls back to events that occurred in different branches of the timeline, which obviously should be impossible. The prevailing theory in the community seems to be the convergence theory. It's the idea that somehow all three timelines have converged. Personally, I don't think I buy that. It just doesn't make a lot of sense. 3 separate events can't have occurred simultaneously in your past. My own theory is that since the Zelda universe is destined to repeat itself over a long enough period of time, you are bound to have some of the same events repeat themselves. It's like that thing. How's it go? You give a million monkeys a million typewriters, and after long enough, they'll end up writing the script for Jurassic Park 2? Something like that. Whatever. My point is that what if Breath of the Wild takes place so far in the future that by complete coincidence, it also had its own Twilight Princess, and its own Wind Waker, and any number of other big Zelda events. Whatever the case though, whether it's the convergence theory or ARLO'S Jurassic Park 2 theory, that's a joke. If anyone credits me for this theory, please do not call it the Jurassic Park 2 theory. Okay, now I know you're gonna call it the Jurassic Park 2 theory, so I'll give it a real name. How about the recurrence theory? Convergence theory, recurrence theory. There you go, no Jurassic Park. Anyway, whether you believe in the revergence theory or the concurrence theory, it's hard to deny that Breath of the Wild changed how we view the timeline. It challenged what we know about Zelda and how its games tend to fit into it. I'll admit, there's the possibility that Breath of the Wild really does fit into one timeline and all the other references can be explained away. But I'm doubtful enough that I'm moving forward under the assumption that at least one of the 2 theories is right, and Breath of the Wild really has broken this whole system open. And when you hold this up against the other lore revelations we've learned about in recent-ish times, suddenly it starts to paint a very interesting picture. A picture that tells me, at least, hey, Zelda ain't the same Zelda you used to know anymore. Because let me paint you a picture, if I might immediately recycle the metaphor. Picture this. Skyward Sword drops those lore bombs on us, and now we know where Ganon comes from and why there are always Links and Zeldas around to fight him, even in cases like Wind Waker where the hero's bloodline is broken. We know that these entities are essentially reincarnating themselves. Then we get Breath of the Wild, where we see a Ganon that feels like he's at the end of his arc, in his most far-out form, regarded less as a person or even a creature and more as a thing, an event, an evil force, and he's actually destroyed most of Hyrule quite successfully, pretty much as close to the complete world domination that he wants as he can possibly get without actually achieving it. I mean, he was 99% of the way there. We also see that the timeline we've been clinging to doesn't matter as much as we once thought, and the game takes place countless years in the future, so much further down the line than any Zelda before it. Then of course we get the sequel, which we'll talk about more in a bit, but at the moment we know that it at least uses the same characters and whatnot. Imagine that years after the sequel, we get the next big Zelda game, and it takes place in Hyrule. And in it, Link and Zelda have to stop Ganon or Ganondorf from conquering it or whatever. It takes place in a clear spot on the timeline. I don't know, after the Adventure of Link or something. Yep, it's 100 years after Adventure of Link, and they gotta stop Ganon again. I think I just detected a simultaneous slight sinking disappointment from thousands of people at once. Like, doesn't that sound lame? We can return to the same themes a number of times, especially now that the lore establishes why that can happen, but I do feel like there is a limit to how many times you can tell the same exact story. Nintendo has done everything they can to revamp the formula over the years. Ocarina of Time retold the same basic Zelda story in Hyrule and framed it as something of an origin story. Majora's Mask took us somewhere else and told us a totally unrelated story. Then Wind Waker brought us back to Hyrule, but obviously everything was very different, seeing as it was all underwater. Then Twilight Princess gave us another traditional Hyrule, but gaming tech was still advancing fast at that point, so it was exciting to see that traditional Hyrule bigger and prettier than ever, and while Ganondorf was the villain, it was at least kind of a secret at first. Then Skyward Sword brought us to a prehistoric Hyrule, giving us an even more origin-y origin story. Breath of the Wild once more took us back to a traditional Hyrule, but the massive open world was the new thing to keep things fresh. But while I believe that in terms of gameplay and design, Breath of the Wild was presenting a new beginning for Zelda, in terms of theme and story, it felt a little like it was reaching a conclusion, for the reasons I've already outlined. Beyond a direct sequel, where do you go after this? I feel like the series has to be gearing up for a massive change. Alright, Arlo, you keep saying that, but what kinds of changes are we talking here? Well, there are a lot of ways that the series can and does change. They could bring us to another kingdom, and personally this is something I'd really like to see. There's some debate surrounding whether Termina is also a nearby land or only a parallel world and how it actually relates to the main world, but at the very least we know that Labrina and Holodrum are neighboring kingdoms, not parallel worlds. Geographical locations other than Hyrule do exist, and I want to see more of them. Then there are new gameplay mechanics to introduce. Wind Waker turned Hyrule into an open sea, and of course Breath of the Wild gave us a more sprawling Hyrule than ever. They could introduce another new traversal mechanic, for example, maybe bring back sailing or give us transformations like in Majora's Mask. But that's all stuff anyone could expect. That's just how game design works. They've got to wrap the whole package up in something new. It's really a given. But what about big changes? Ones that feel like Skyward Sword and Breath of the Wild have been leading up to? What kind of giant change would feel like it made sense at this point? One of my own theories is that more than just getting a new mechanic or two, Nintendo is gearing up for some major thematic and visual experimentation. How much more huge and beautiful can Hyrule get after Breath of the Wild, beyond more graphical polish? I think if they want to have any hope of wowing us again, they're going to need to give us new world-encompassing themes that they have never tried before. What if there are massive cities to explore, like you see in other open-world games? What if Hyrule is hugely industrialized and we get something akin to a steampunk aesthetic? Or, here's a big one. They have been teasing the technological side of the Zelda universe for years now. Presumably because of Demise's curse, instead of technology being progressive like in the real world, it's cyclical. There was always some ancient race from thousands of years ago with tech that no one knows how to make anymore. Twilight Princess had the Oka with their city in the sky. Ugh. Skyward Sword took it further with time travel crystals and electrified industrial plants and robots. Then of course Breath of the Wild took it further than it's ever been and gave us shrines and giant Zords and spider bots with laser eyes and magical energy arrows that vaporize things on impact. They're not even being shy about it anymore. It's heavily implied that it's all based on magic, but there's no denying that this is straight up sci-fi stuff. It's robots, for Pete's sake. Would it be crazy to suggest that maybe, just maybe, Nintendo is preparing us for a full sci-fi Zelda? Even if Link and Zelda aren't like flying around in spaceships or whatever, maybe at the very least they're living in one of the eras of amazing tech that the games are always pulling from? Tell me that's ridiculous. Tell me I'm drawing ridiculous conclusions and I'm getting my hopes up ridiculously high. But it doesn't feel so ridiculous to me anymore. It feels like the sort of giant shift that would fit perfectly well in a post-Breath of the Wild Zelda universe. Even if Zelda doesn't go full sci-fi though, sigh, I think a similar shift in style would make perfect sense. Without such experimentation, after the novelty of a giant open-world Zelda has worn off and Breath of the Wild's flaws have been fixed in its sequel, hopefully, we're gonna need something big. Shrinking the scope of the games will just leave people disappointed. Breath of the Wild set the bar so high, but change the whole feel and style of the game, and you can do just about whatever you want with it. If we're looking for a more tangible change, though, we can look no further than the series' great big baddie, Ganon with Dorf in parentheses. As I already established, I think it's time for the guy to throw in the towel. We've just seen him so many times, and eventually that somewhat comfortable sense of predictability starts to give way to annoyance. One of the ways they've dealt with this overuse is to make him the villain, but you don't realize it until partway through the game, like in Twilight Princess. But even that is gonna feel old if they do it again at this point. Breath of the Wild's Ganon just feels like the end of Ganon to me. And if there's one more thing they can do with him, I hope they do it in the game's sequel, which we should finally talk about. Based on the reveal trailer, I think it's safe to assume that what we see here is Ganondorf. He seems to be held in place by some sort of sealing spell, and it has been confirmed that the little squigglies here are Gerudo script. This changes a lot because it suggests that Calamity Ganon was more of an animalistic spirit creature because he was merely a projection of sorts of the real Ganondorf who's been sealed in place in this weird cave for who even knows how long. This explains why when Zelda beats Ganon at the end of Breath of the Wild, he just sort of poofs away, and it's like, wait, what happened to him? Did you kill him, or what? One could argue that my notions of Ganon being at the end of his arc because he's such a raw entity of pure hatred are now up in smoke, because clearly we are returning to Ganondorf the man in the sequel. He's not completely gone, but to that I say, this still looks like a pretty darn late arc Ganon to me. Desiccated undead Ganon who's been sealed away for tens of thousands of years at least? A Ganon who's so powerful he can possess legions of killer robots and reduce Hyrule to rubble, all while taking a nap? Yeah, in my eyes, this still feels like it could easily be the end of Ganon's story. If anything, now more so than ever, because we get to see him in the humanoid form he started in. We get to see the furthest advanced stages of both his forms. There is an excellent theory going around that the game might actually see Ganon redeemed. Ganondorf started out as a regular old Gerudo male. We don't technically know if Demise or Hylia or the hero are literally reincarnated, or if maybe their spirits just possess the right suitors, but if the latter is true, then it is at least slightly feasible that Ganondorf the man could somehow be exorcised of Demise's spirit, or otherwise cleansed of his curse. I love this theory. It would be a terrific way to retire the character, especially if it dug into Ganondorf's memories and offered us some more personal details like we saw in his monologue at the end of Wind Waker. It would give us a solid reason for him not to return, and it could even suggest that breaking the curse would remove him as a threat in the future for all timelines. And after that, Demise, or his hatred, however you want to look at it, would be forced to find a new host. Unfortunately, this is a theory that I just don't have a lot of faith in. If I'm completely honest and even a little defeatist, it's just too cool. I just don't think it is something the Zelda team will do. A villain's a villain after all, and correct me if I'm wrong, but the Zelda world is usually pretty black and white. You've got somewhat roguish characters who do bad things for selfish reasons, but at the end of the day, there are good guys and bad guys. Rehumanizing Ganon after all these years and offering him redemption through some cool continuum-spanning spiritual cleansing, probably not gonna happen. But I do think that even if Ganon ends up just being another bad guy to fight in Breath of the Wild sequel, I still think the stakes could be high enough that it offers a perfect ending for the character. Or at the very least, a point at which the Zelda team will be able to take a sizable break from him. Even if they don't want to retire him permanently, it could still end something of an arc and open the door for a new villain. Because even if they want to keep bringing us back to Hyrule, and they don't want to make any stylistic changes quite as drastic as putting Link in a mech and giving Zelda a ray gun, a new villain would work wonders when it came to keeping the series fresh. You can still have dungeons and treasure chests and 3 spiritual doodads to collect at the start of the game, or bombs and arrows, anything else that makes you think of Zelda, but a new incarnation of Demise would drastically change the story, and of course a new villain's personality would make everything feel more fresh. But Arlo, you might be saying. Are you sure there even can be a new incarnation of Demise? Demise said that an incarnation of his hatred would live on, not incarnations. That's true, he did say that, but here's where it's pretty easy to fudge things. Between differences in localization and little inconsistencies from game to game, this is exactly the sort of detail that can go either way. Saying an incarnation wouldn't technically be wrong even if there did end up being more than one. It very well might be a set-in-stone rule at Nintendo that Ganon really is the one true reincarnation of Demise. But if they did decide that him taking a new form would be a cool idea, they'd make it happen, regardless of what Demise himself might have said in Skyward Sword. Plus, Ganondorf did reincarnate in Four Swords Adventures. He came back as another Gerudo, so he was basically the same guy again. But it reminds us that reincarnation into a completely different physical body is possible, as is Ganon officially dying. So, if it's true that Ganon can indeed throw in the towel and Demise can indeed return as someone new, what are our options? Well, we can always return to an old villain. The series hasn't had a ton of other major ones, but Majora, Malladus, and Vaati do fit the bill. As with many things in the world of Zelda, there is debate surrounding the idea that one or more of these guys were already other reincarnations of Demise. Because we know that all 3 existed at the same time as Ganon, it is certainly debatable, though I must admit that Malladus' origin is super vague, and he looks a heck of a lot like a certain piggy someone that I know. I could be convinced that Demise's spirit taking on multiple forms was possible though. Again, they can just kind of fudge it however they want. Even if that's not the case though, we could just as easily have a few Zelda games go by with no reincarnated Demise at all. People are allowed to be villains even if they're not Demiselings, right? Vaati is the only Ganon alternative that's been in multiple games, so even if he isn't one, I would love to see him return. He's only been in 2D games as well, so putting him in a 3D game and maybe even fleshing his character out a bit more would just be awesome. Or give us some other cool one-off villains like Majora. How about a female Gerudo who starts a war wishing to carry out the deceased Ganondorf's will? How about another deranged Twilight who's somehow found another way out of the Twilight Realm? How about a Goron who excavates one of Ganon's old swords and is possessed by his residual spirit? I love the idea of villains that are real races instead of just vague demon entities. That's one of the reasons Ganondorf himself is such a great villain. He started out as just a dude. Seriously, I could probably fill a whole video with ideas for new villains. For straight up Demise reincarnations and ongoing villains though, they probably wouldn't want to use any of Hyrule's more fantastical races like the ones I've mentioned. Ganondorf and Vaati aren't Hylians, but they're still from very human-like races. I mean, Vaati was technically a Picori, but then he, becomes basically a human guy for some reason. I don't really get it. Something tells me that they just prefer a more human-like villain, and that a new villain would probably follow the same trend, unfortunately. Maybe it'd be a Hylian, maybe some other new human-like race. Whatever the case, though, they could at least have unique final forms. Ganondorf has always favored pigginess, and Vaati is more of a giant floating black eye kind of guy. A new villain could turn into a serpent, or a spider, or a feline, or a goat, or an alpaca, or a chihuahua, I don't know, whatever you want. The sky's the limit. Go nuts. Doesn't just have to be pigs and floating eyes for all of eternity. You know what? There is a part of me that thinks all this has to be ridiculous. Sometimes I dream about new villains for a while, but then I take a step back and go, wait a second. This is Nintendo. They're not getting rid of Ganon. He's Ganon. It's Nintendo. Legacy characters are their thing. Maybe I'll get what I want and Breath of the Wild sequel really will close out his story and we can look forward to a new villain. Maybe they'll at least take a little break from him and give us someone new for a handful of titles. Or maybe we'll actually get a crazy sci-fi Zelda in the future, revamping the entire thing. But, of course, maybe I'm just totally wrong about everything, and after the Breath of the Wild sequel, things will go back to being steady and predictable, with regular old Ganondorf and a regular old story in a regular old Hyrule. But man, I don't think that'll happen. At least not anytime soon. I can't look at Skyward Sword in one hand and Breath of the Wild 1 and 2 in the other and expect such a thing to come next. Nintendo loves to surprise and delight, and I think it is very likely that the series is going to continue to change drastically. Maybe that won't end up looking like one sudden massive change like a new villain or major style, but I do think whatever happens, surprise and delight it will. Maybe I'm silly for getting my hopes up so high, but when the next Nintendo system comes around and a new Zelda is revealed for it, I am expecting something very new. And by that, I mean I am 100% expecting Sci-Fi Zelda. Come on, Nintendo, it would be so cool. I mean, you already gave Link a motorcycle. You gave him vaporizing arrows. Just go that extra step and put him on a Hyrule-sized space station habitat and make him fight cyborg moblins with ray guns. I want it, I want it, I want it, I want it! So what do you say? Is the Zelda universe due for a big change, or is it absurd to think that Nintendo will want to stray from their tried and true formula? Well, I guess we'll just have to wait and see when the Zelda game after Breath of the Wild 2 is revealed in 9 years. See you then!